Ohmies, welcome to a special interview of the week. This week I have with me Kolten from Liquity. You're the business development, or what's your proper title? The partnerships manager?
Pretty much, but
I
I guess the official title is head of growth, but it definitely encompasses a lot of the business development work, marketing work, partnership work, all that good stuff. So we're a really small team, so we all take on a lot of different hats, or wear a lot of different hats, which is amazing. You get to explore all of these different avenues for bettering yourself in your career. So it's been really fun.
Very cool. How big's the team there?
The team is, as of recently, 9 people strong, with a couple of advisors. So we were 8 for a while, and we recently hired a COO. His name is Michael, and he'll be helping out on the biz dev side as well, but also doing typical COO things, making sure the company is running smoothly.
Very cool. So is there like a company structure that sits behind it? Like, is it like a Labs LLC or something?
Yeah, exactly. It's a Swiss-based company, so I think they use like AG. So the company itself is Liquity AG. Only one of us, which is Robert, the founder, or actually now the COO. So the CEO and COO are both based in Switzerland, and then the rest of the team is globally distributed. But yeah, it's a company setup, and very, I guess, uncommon in the space these days with the sort of reemergence of DAOs, but comes with its trade-offs, comes with its benefits, but it's interesting for sure, especially like collaborating from company to DAO, which is very different than DAO to DAO relationships. So that's been a really interesting sort of thing to navigate, especially recently.
Yeah. You had like an offsite recently. Is that like one of the perks?
Yeah, I guess it is one of the perks. Unfortunately, I did not get to go to the offsite because I ended up getting COVID, and so I didn't get to go to the offsite, but the rest of the team got to go, and it was amazing. And I just kind of participated remotely, but it was really cool. Like, unfortunately, I didn't get to meet the team, but everybody else got to meet, which is great. And the world's starting to open up a lot more, so hopefully we can do another one in the near future. But yeah, I guess DAO offsites are a little less common. It's harder to aggregate, 150 people or whatever it is.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, maybe I think like a lot of people would have like a kind of understanding that Liquity makes this stablecoin LUSD, and it's sort of fully backed by ETH, and then it's got this governance token LQTY that is kind of the fee capture token. Is that kind of what it is at a high level?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, I mean, except for the governance part, which I can touch on really quickly. So Liquity is a decentralized borrowing protocol that allows users to deposit ETH and then borrow LUSD against that ETH interest-free. On the token side, so we're actually completely governance free, and the contracts are completely immutable. So very Uniswap style, I guess, until recently when Uniswap launched governance. But for the most part, Uniswap's contracts are completely immutable, especially Uniswap v2. So our contracts are built in that same exact way. We can't change anything about them. We can't go in and pass a governance proposal to get those get the parameters adjusted, etc. So the LQTY token is really a reward mechanism and a way for its holders to sort of claim revenue on the system. So LQTY stakers earn 100% of all of the revenue generated by Liquity itself.
So that's the profit after, because you pay. There's a part of the profits go to distributed front-end operators. Is that right?
So we have this sort of distributed front-end model where anybody can run a front-end for Liquity, because we don't run one ourselves as a company, which is, I guess, pretty unique these days, though it's starting to get a little more popular. But yeah, the LQTY token is also used to incentivize those front-end operators. So we have this one mechanism, which we can touch on maybe in a bit, called the stability pool, which sort of underwrites all of the loans in the system. So whenever a position is liquidated, the LUSD sitting in the stability pool is used to sort of pay off that bad debt. And front ends are rewarded for encouraging their users to deposit to this pool. So there's two ways rewards work in the stability pool. Whenever users deposit, they earn LQTY as a function of time. So the longer you're in the pool, the more LQTY you earn. Very traditional yield farming type of strategy. And then they also earn ETH whenever liquidations occur. Like I mentioned, the LUSD is used to pay off bad debt in return for that position's collateral. And so where front ends come into this is whenever users deposit LQTY LUSD to the stability pool, they earn a portion of their users' accrued LQTY rewards. So the front ends can also set this. So for example, let's say that a front end sets a kickback rate of 99%. That means they'll receive 1% of all of the LQTY rewards their users receive for depositing to the stability pool. And I'm happy to dive into each little section if we need to kind of get some clarity there. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, it's like at a super high level, it's pretty easy, but then trying to understand all the mechanisms gets a bit hard. But yeah, let's start back and get to know about you a little bit.
Sure.
So when did you what's your background kind of before crypto, and then how did you fall into crypto?
Yeah, so my intro to crypto is like really weird and kind of long-winded, but basically I stumbled upon it when I was in high school. Specifically, I stumbled upon Bitcoin when I was in high school in 2011, 2012 or so, completely on accident. I was into cybersecurity at the time, which is really random, but I was into cybersecurity at the time. And during 2011, 2012 was like the rise of the end of the rise of the anonymous movement. The Silk Road was kind of at its peak. And so couldn't really be interested in cybersecurity without stumbling upon those things. And Bitcoin was really popular in those circles. But I never really thought much of it. I thought it was cool, but the idea kind of just made sense to me. I was like, oh, of course, this thing exists, which I don't know, maybe that was like naive at the time. But I kind of vaguely kept up with it even when I got to university in 2014. One of the first talks I actually gave in my computer science class was about Bitcoin. And I still have the slides to this day, and they're completely awful. Had a really only a basic understanding of what was going on. And then it wasn't until 2016 that I fell, sort of fully down the rabbit hole. I watched this like TechCrunch video of Vitalik talking about Ethereum, and it really fascinated me. And so I just kind of dove into the space head first. But I was still in school, so hadn't started working in the space or anything, just started following it really closely. And then it wasn't until 2019 that I had kind of graduated college in 2018, worked in esports for a little while doing video production, graphic design, motion design. And then in 2019, crypto was taking up so much of my time that I knew I had to work in this space. So I ended up getting a position as a community manager at the Stellar Development Foundation and stayed there for like two and a half years or so, really developing my skills. Yeah, I was at Stellar first. That was my sort of first real job out of college. Before that, I was doing a lot of freelance stuff in esports, and then SDF was my first real job, and I really had the opportunity to sort of grow as a professional there before joining Liquity.
What are they up to now? I remember like getting shilled Stellar in 2017. And people were like, "This is backed by IBM, man. It's gonna be the best crypto in the world."
Yeah, so they spent, I think they spend a lot of time in a different part of the crypto space. They're really trying to connect sort of more traditional financial institutions through crypto, and that's just such a hard thing to do. And especially because some of these institutions, you mentioned IBM, like they're so slow to move and adopt new technology that it was a pretty difficult uphill battle. So yeah, that's where they're focused mostly, and that's why if you're super into DeFi, you probably don't hear of what they're up to much. But we were really focused on onboarding a lot of traditional financial institutions, and encouraging them to issue stablecoins and other sort of highly regulated assets on chain. So I don't know as much what they're up to since I left and since I joined Liquity, but that's what we were up to before I parted ways.
Yeah. All right. Cool. So did you like when was the first time you like really got in yourself? Was it like 2017 or were you in? I'm interested in like some war stories if you have any from like the early
Yeah.
days.
So in 2016 was when I kind of bought my first little bit of Bitcoin and a little bit of ETH. And the story was that my roommate at the time, we were still in college, and he was kind of day trading, I think oil stocks or something like that. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to save up, my first little bit of money, and I'm going to invest in oil stocks with him. Cause he was a petroleum engineer at the school we were going at. So he had a little bit of a bias there. And
Yeah.
and that's kind of how I actually stumbled upon that Vitalik video. I was like, okay, I'd saved up this $1,000, but I thought to myself, man, like I saved up this $1,000, which was a lot to me, a whole lot to me in college at the time. I was like, but this Bitcoin thing, every time I look at it, the price keeps going up, and maybe I should just check out that. And so I kind of was digging around on YouTube, stumbled upon the Vitalik video, and I was like, you know what, I'm just going to throw it into crypto. And I guess, that was a good decision. I wish I had saved up way more than $1,000, but
Yeah.
I learned a lot from between 2016, 2017, and 2018. The main thing I learned though was that I was definitely not a trader. So made a lot of mistakes there, bad financial decisions, but
Yeah.
it was all a learning experience leading into sort of DeFi Summer in 2020, and it never
Yeah.
deterred me. I just kept going.
Mm. You got it. Like, I mean, you look back at some of your early decisions and you're like, it's either like you made like a bit of money or you like just lost everything. And then like the next sort of time you get in, you're like, if the earlier time had been different, like you think about how different things could have been. Like, do you agree with that? Or do you
Yeah,
have
no,
a story with that?
I think that's exactly right. Like you experiment, you learn, you fail a lot in this space. And I think a lot of people's sort of entry point is trading. And I just kind of realized really quickly that was not for me. I'm much more of a long-term position type of guy now. I like to really invest in the success of the projects I, either work with or talk to or whatever else. So, yeah, you kind of learn a lot, you fall on your face a lot, but that's all part of it. I mean, it's a really fast-moving industry, and there's so much opportunity out there for you to, pick yourself back up if you ever do fail. So, yeah, I completely agree.
Were you in DeFi Summer? Like, were you around for like Compound and Yam and like
Yeah,
YFI?
I was there for all of it. I actually have one of the I'm pretty sure there was like this original YFI NFT that you got if you were a YFI farmer.
I
So
played for YFI or something.
yeah, it was
It's
it was that NFT.
little racket or something.
Yeah, I definitely have it. So I was there for all of it, which was really amazing, and it was just cool. It was cool to see because it was like, okay, here's my redemption arc, right? I'd made all these bad trading decisions up until then, and DeFi Summer was like the perfect way to sort of like play financial games and earn cool tokens and participate in governance and all that cool stuff. So yeah, I was there for all of it, and it was really fun. And at the time, I was still at Stellar, so it was like I would literally be working all day and then just go home, and then it was like DeFi Summer all day. It's all it was. I never got to unplug.
Yeah, it's a bit like that working in a DAO as well. Do you when did you sort of first come across Ohm? Can you tell us about that? Because you've got, I assume you have a bit of Ohm after working with us so closely.
Yeah. I wish I remembered the original person who DM'd me, but I don't think it was somebody who is in the DAO at the moment, or at least it's not somebody I remember talking to recently. But yeah, somebody hopped into the Liquity Discord at some point and was like, hey, there's this Olympus project. We want you guys to do like a treasury swap or something like that. And mind you, Olympus was very small at the time, like a tiny fraction of what the size Liquity was. And they were mentioning like $1 million treasury swap or something like that. I was like, man, there's no way I can justify that internally, right? For this like really, really small project. And then on top of that, we're not a DAO. So like doing stuff like that has a lot of tax implications, legal implications, etc. So I was like, okay, there's nothing really we can do here. And that was the only pitch I got. There wasn't a pitch to do like LUSD bonds or LUSD owned bonds or anything like that. So I'd kind of first heard about Olympus there, and then I started doing some digging on my own, and I found the project a little bit later as it started to grow. And then I started finding the project really interesting. And then someone who was a lot more active in the DAO, I presume, ended up reaching out. I wish I could remember who it was. I'm forgetting all my names, but they proposed the sort of LUSD bonds, and LUSD being a good candidate for a sort of reserve asset. And I was like, okay, this really makes sense for Liquity, right? If we want to launch this decentralized stablecoin, it's important that it's a fundamental pillar in all of these new DeFi experiments. So there was a two-pronged approach there to my introduction to Ohm, but the original one wasn't as favorable as the second.
Yeah. So what was your like first impression? Were you like, oh, this is gonna fail, this is a Ponzi? Or were you like, great, if you want LUSD, you take it, guys?
Well, I thought it was interesting. I didn't really have strong opinions on whether it was going to fail or succeed, because I tried not to do that too much in the space, because I mean, it's hard to know, right? Like I won't pretend that I'm an expert on predicting, what's going to last over the next 5 years. Even
Dog
like
money, for example.
Yeah, like even Liquity, for example, was a crazy experiment in borrowing, and so like it's hard to know. And so when I first heard the idea, I was like, okay, this is a really interesting approach. It's one of the approaches that I like the most. For regarding the way a lot of these like algorithmic stables or reserve assets, et cetera, have been tried. And then I kind of brought it up internally, and even Robert and a couple of the other teammates who are more into like mechanism design and game theory than I am thought it was also interesting. So it's like, okay, this has the thumbs up from some smart people that I trust. My gut says it's pretty interesting. Like this kind of makes sense to do. And if anybody, and the other aspect of it was the community was so massive and so passionate, which from a from a game theory perspective is extremely, extremely important for a project like Olympus. I mean, even recently we've seen, I don't even know how many forks launch, but half of them either rug or fail because they just don't have, the initial community bootstrapping the success. So whenever I saw all of the technical aspects checked out, the community aspect checked out, it kind of just really made sense for us to pursue a close integration, which ended up being massively successful.
Yeah, it's like, what is it? Olympus now, like the 7th biggest holder or something?
It might even be higher, honestly. We were just talking about this the other day with Abby and Glue on the Liquity Live episode that we did, and I think it might even be one of the top 5 holders. But Olympus is definitely the largest project holding LUSD, if I'm not mistaken, especially the largest DAO, except I think Fei Protocol might give the DAO a run for their money whenever they launch this new 100 million LUSD acquisition plan that they recently proposed to governance. So we might have to turn those bonds back on and let Olympus DAO get the number 1 spot again afterwards.
Yeah, it's Fei's super interesting. I think like just like, oh, we've got this like $1 billion treasury or whatever it is. It's like, so weird that you can like raise so much money at your launch, and then and you see it with like a lot of projects, right? It's just an attention game really, and people want to see like a big upside.
Yeah.
So maybe you can just talk about 0% interest loans and how you think they might affect economies. Like, because I talk to like my friends and family, and I'm like, oh, well, there's going to be 0% interest loans, right? And I mean, I assume Liquity is going to build it out for other assets and whatnot, but like, if you can take a 0% interest loan, then you never have to pay it back, and it's just kind of changes how you see money and how the incentive structures work. How do you explain it to people? And they're like, so there is no interest. How are you making money? Like,
yeah. There. It's been a really interesting problem to solve, because I mean, the first big project that really allowed collateralized borrowing on Ethereum was MakerDAO. So Maker really set the standard for what the user should expect from such a borrowing experience, and essentially MakerDAO has a pretty high collateral ratio, minimum collateral ratio, but they also have variable interest rates. So For anybody who is around kind of in early DeFi summer, even maybe like pre-DeFi summer, I can't remember the year, but there was a period where DAI's sort of interest rate or stability fee went from like some super low percentage, at least like a single digit percentage, to something like 20% within 2-3 weeks or something like that. So if you're a borrower, you saw your interest rate change dramatically over the course of a very short time frame, and then eventually it went back down. So like whenever you have stuff like that kind of setting the standard for what this experience should be like, launching Liquity was really interesting because people are like, okay, well, what's the catch, right? There's always a catch. There's always trade-offs. And to understand how Liquity offers interest freeness, you have to kind of understand how the borrowing and redemption mechanism works. So whenever you borrow, it's not completely free, right? So interest free doesn't mean simply just free. So instead of paying an interest rate over the duration of your loan, you just pay a one-time borrowing fee at the loan origination. So once you borrow, so let's say you borrow 2,000 LUSD, there's usually the fee is usually at its lowest, which is 0.5%. So you'll just pay $10 off that 2,000 LUSD upfront, and you don't have to worry about the cost anymore after that. And the way that we allow for this, and something like MakerDAO doesn't, is because interest in a lot of these protocols is used as this sort of economic lever to expand and contract stablecoin supply. So for example, historically, and there's other reasons for this, but this is a big one. Like historically, if DAI was trading above peg, Maker would lower the interest rate to encourage DAI supply expansion, so that way the price goes back down. And the inverse of that is also true. So if DAI was below peg, you hike up the interest rates to encourage people to pay off their debt and then shrink the outstanding DAI supply to increase the price. So the way LUSD kind of handles this supply dynamic is through what we call a redemption mechanism. So at any time, anybody can redeem LUSD against the system as if it's worth $1. And I'll address two parts of this. So the first part is that creates an instant arbitrage mechanism whenever LUSD floats below $1. So let's say it's 98 cents. You can buy up a bunch of it, redeem it against the system for ETH, and then sell that ETH and keep the arbitrage profit. The way the redemption works under the hood is that the redeemed LUSD actually pays off the debt of the riskiest positions in the system in return for their collateral. So this is a completely new dynamic that's never existed before in DeFi, this idea of paying off somebody else's debt in return for their collateral. It'd be almost like, let's say you have a car and you took out a loan for the car, and then I come and pay off your loan, and then I get to keep your car. It's kind of a similar situation. Only in DeFi could you really get away with something like this. In the real world, it's a little bit harder, but that's the sort of underlying mechanism that allows for interest freeness, because we've kind of introduced this new redemption mechanism to handle that supply and demand dynamic of LUSD itself.
Yeah. But with the 0% interest loans, right? I mean, once you take the loan, do you have to pay like a fee to pay it back? Is that right? Like it's another 0.5%? Or?
Nope. You only pay the 0.5% at loan origination, and then you can keep it open as long as you want. And so like, obviously, if you're a long-term ETH holder and you really want to keep that ETH position for forever, I mean, being able to take out a loan with sort of no terms on it, and then you know your cost to borrow up front, is a pretty sweet deal. I mean, even recently we saw, I won't name drop because it may not be appropriate, but we saw a prominent crypto figurehead tweet about how they use Liquity to actually borrow money to buy their house, which is amazing, right? Because that, I'm sure that beats almost any interest rate they would have gotten from a bank. So if they had enough ETH, they put it into the system, they borrowed their LUSD, they paid that 0.5% up front, and then now they could just pay that LUSD off or whenever they want. They can do it on any timeline versus whatever the bank has to say or whatever. On top of that, they didn't have to walk into a bank and fill out all this like crazy paperwork and do all these background checks or everything else that they do.
It kind of changes the tax game as well, doesn't it? Like if you can take a loan against your assets, in a lot of countries that's not a taxable event. And then if you never have to pay it back because you're not paying, like you have no incentive to, it's going to create these really weird kind of problems for governments. But that's not your guys' concern. You're just
Yeah,
providing a solution.
I'm by no means a tax expert or anything, but I have seen people talking about this, and it's really interesting. I mean, I hope that Liquity is favorable for people in terms of taxes, but I guess it depends a lot on your jurisdiction and your situation, etc. But yeah, I have heard a lot of people talking about this, so I hope it's true. Maybe I'll find out at the end of the year when I talk to my tax professionals, and they'll give me some good news. And I hope the same is true for a lot of our users. That would be really cool.
Yeah, I played around a bit with Liquity before the interview, and the front ends are really, like, some of them are really cool. They've got like all this info, and like they have all these different ways they represent your loan, and then you can just go over to another front end, and then they've got this other cool feature which, you know, the first one you tried didn't have. Have you checked them all out? What's your like kind of impression? Are they slowly improving over time and people keeping on developing them? Is that
It's been a bit of a mix of both. Like there are some people, I mean, obviously whenever you have a situation where, let's say I think right now there's over 20 front ends. I mean, the Pareto distribution kind of applies in terms of success. Like that there are a handful of Liquity front ends that account for the majority of users, and they have the majority of users and capital flowing through them. And so I think with a lot of those, they're a little bit more motivated to continue innovating and growing their user base just because it's an important revenue stream for them. Mm-hmm. While the bottom tier, and I don't mean bottom tier as a judgment on the quality of their front end, just the bottom tier in terms of performance, they generally get a little bit unmotivated, which is fair enough, right? If you're doing something and it takes a lot of effort and a lot of work and you're not making a lot of money from it, then it can kind of be a little bit demoralizing and maybe not worth your time, which is totally fine. And I think so. We've seen a mix of both, but we're also starting to see some really creative front ends like DeFi Saver and InstaDApp and a couple of others who are introducing a lot of functionality that users just otherwise wouldn't have, like, you know, one-click leverage, for example. The ability to just sign a couple of transactions and get levered up is amazing. Or like DeFi Saver allows you to transfer your maker vault to a Liquity trove very easily. They set up this sort of recipe for you. So we're starting to see a bunch of cool tooling like that. So I think it's kind of only the beginning stages, but we try our best to like put out resources for front ends to succeed. We also pass on a lot of the user feedback we get to make sure that, you know, front ends know what's working and what's not. Also, when we see issues occur or issues with the UX, we always try to keep in touch and make sure that front ends are aware of it. So it's been interesting. I think, you know, that we've learned a lot from kind of introducing this like new paradigm to DeFi about like incentivizing decentralized front ends. It's been tried before and it's just never really worked. And so we're the first ones who have kind of pulled it off in a way that's really successful. But it also, you know, it comes with its challenges. So we're always constantly improving those. And I ask anyone who has feedback for us on how we can better, you know, manage our front ends and encourage innovation to please reach out and let us know.
Yeah, very cool. I like DeFi Saver. It's a really good way for them to be able to monetize as well, because they provided all these services, but they couldn't really get any sort of funding from like providing a make or die nice sort of interface that you have. So yeah, very cool. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about Liquity, and if you're able to, sort of what is the roadmap from here? Like, you've made this 0% interest loans. It's this new primitive, this new way to pay back loans, decentralized front ends. Is there still more to be done with this Liquity in terms of is it, you know, a growth game kind of promotion and making sure the front ends are great and keeping on doing that, or is there a kind of a roadmap where we see more assets kind of being able to use the like Liquity kind of process, and then the fee gets captured to a new token, or it goes back to the old token? Or can you tell us? And appreciate you might not be able to say very much on
Yeah,
this.
I can't leak too much alpha, but the real focus is and has been for a while on just continuing to grow network effects around LUSD. And I know you know this from working in the DAO, that like network effects around anything, like whether it's a stablecoin or reserve asset, are extremely, extremely important. If you don't have those, there's no demand for your asset or stablecoin. And then if there's no demand for your asset or stablecoin, there's no borrowing demand. And so if there's no demand for either borrowing or using LUSD, then there's just no reason for the protocol to exist. So we've been really focused on doing things like growing liquidity around LUSD, but also trying to spearhead the adoption of more unique use cases, whether it's, like the integration with Olympus, or recently the integration with Fei, or, we're also talking to a couple of other DAOs who are interested in diversifying into LUSD. So that's really been our focus. And the other thing is like just growing the core user base. So we still have a long way to go in terms of marketing and brand recognition. I mean, MakerDAO, Compound, Aave, and a couple of our other competitors just have a much longer head start. We only launched around 7-8 months ago. And so we're trying to move really quickly on growing the brand, but whenever somebody has a 2-3 year head start, it's a long hill to climb. So we've been really focusing on education, getting content out, growing our core user base, making sure that people know who we are, know how to use Liquity, and know how to succeed within the ecosystem. There are some other things we're researching internally, so we haven't completely stopped innovating. Like, it doesn't just end immediately with Liquity, but we're still so early phase in there that I don't want to reveal too much, just in case. I don't want to make false promises or anything like that. So I do want everybody to know that the innovation doesn't stop. Right, we're always researching, and we're always focusing on how we can improve the Liquity ecosystem.
I saw on Twitter the other day there was like a bit of a discussion around Liquity, and the peg was a little bit off, and then some of the mechanisms were taking a while to kick in. And then I think it was Tetranode was saying, Liquity, they should have had it mutable, like had been able to change parameters for at least like a year or whatever. Do you think there's some truth to the criticisms? Or, I mean, it fixed itself in like less than 24 hours from what I could see. Do you sometimes think, that would have been better? I suppose it just brings in a whole lot of regulatory issues that's the whole idea, not to have them, right?
Right. That's a really good question. It's something we kind of, one, we thought a lot about before launch, but two, we think a lot about now. I mean, having governance and having the ability to change certain parameters or tweak certain parameters or add new functionality, all of that stuff has its trade-offs, just like not having it has its trade-offs. So I mean, of course, if we could make changes, or if we had governance, we'd have flexibility that we don't have now. But on the flip side of that, I think a lot of our users find comfort in the system as is. And how big that addressable user base is, I have no idea. We're still in the process of discovering that. But I think so many of our users just enjoy the fact that they know, like, okay, they know that the terms aren't going to change out from under them. They know that no weird collateral types that add new risk to the system are going to get added. They know basically how the stablecoin works and how its stability works. And so all in all, they just know the rules of the game, and they know those rules aren't going to change without their permission or through some, weird governance vote. So yeah. It's just one of those trade-offs we made. Sometimes I wish we could just like tweak something, or like, I don't know, just get something passed through governance. Sure. But on the flip side, I also just enjoy that the system can live as simply as it does. And there's no room for like human error like my own. Right. So I just mentioned it would be cool to change stuff, but that's probably not the best idea to have me thinking of ideas and like injecting them into a system without everybody's permission. So I don't know. It's a weird challenge, but sometimes the criticism is warranted, sometimes it isn't. And I think most of the time when it isn't, it's just because they don't fully understand the philosophy of not only our company, but Liquity, the protocol. And so after spending a little bit of time talking to us or talking to the community, people kind of generally change their minds.
First of all, is it like kind of like a sizable community and they're kind of attached to the success of Liquity because they, own some Liquity and they're like invested in the project? And do you think that could have been different, or it's more effective if it's kind of a governance token rather than a fee capture token in general? And what is the kind of state of the Liquity community? There's no DAO, but you have a community, right?
We talk about this all the time internally because, I mean, at the end of the day, there's like, I don't think it's a secret that a lot of communities just sort of, or a lot of projects rather, just kind of launch a token and slap governance on so they can sort of bootstrap a community, which in and of itself is not problematic. It's just kind of the reality that, having a speculative token and having governance is sort of this like cheat code to building an ecosystem, right? It's the way that people get involved, the way that people get active. And so for us, we've had to find a different approach to having that same sort of feel. And I think the way we do it, and I hope it's useful to our ecosystem, is we really focus on education. So we want to make sure that when somebody discovers Liquity, they can really succeed as a user, not just in borrowing LUSD, but using LUSD and engaging with our partners and using our integrations and, hopefully becoming involved in our partners' communities. And so per integration, we do the best we can to get out as much content around that integration, just so that our users just know how to use it. They know how to engage in it. They hopefully get active in that community. And we also make sure that we have a ton of educational content around Liquity itself for the same reason. So that's where we've spent a lot of our time. And I think, while our community isn't massive, it's definitely not the size of the Olympus community, for example. It is pretty big, and it also is very helpful and collaborative, and like people are always in there asking questions and teaching each other and figuring out where the alpha is for different Liquity integrations. And so it's a little bit of a different vibe, which is cool for us because it could be the alternative where we just have no community at all because there's just no governance to rally around. So I think the approach we have works within the context of Liquity. So that's been a cool little experiment. But I guess the short answer is just a major focus on education is how we've managed to grow out and build out our community. And it is very different from a sort of governance-based community.
Yeah. I mean, you kind of, in some respects, like you giving people questions they have to decide on is a super powerful way to activate them and make them sort of think about the trade-offs and whether or not they think it's the right decision, and kind of then they're invested in the outcome as well. And then it must be a little bit difficult not kind of having that, and kind of the people in the community, I suppose, are just interested in the project, or maybe they've bought some Liquity tokens and they're invested in the upside of Liquity's success. Is that kind of how you see it as well? Or
yeah, that's right. And we also have, it's really funny because we also have people who since they know that the system can't be changed, they're also critical, or instead of being critical of the system, they're critical of like the direction of, critical in a good way, of the direction of integrations, or like who should we be integrating with, or who are the partners we should be talking to. And for me, that makes my job way easier when we get that type of feedback, because I'm like, okay, here's what our core user base wants, here's the direction they want us to go, and here's what makes sense for them. And so as long as we can build out an ecosystem that's beneficial for them, it encourages them to stay along and keep participating, etc. So there's all of these different aspects that have been really cool to see develop that I don't think would exist if we had governance. Because if we had governance, I mean, we'd probably be bickering about like, what is the next change we're going to add to Liquity? But since that sort of simple foundation is removed, we're just focused on like, all right, how can we continue to grow this ecosystem that we have here and set people up for success?
Just different questions. So can it go cross-chain? I suppose you could go to L2s. How would that work? Or is that even something that can happen?
You're asking all of the right questions that we think about a ton internally. And I think on the L2 front or multi-chain front, I just think it'd be too difficult, to be completely honest, from a technical perspective. So whenever you think about a project like Uniswap or SushiSwap or some other sort of generalized protocol, maybe it's Aave, they can sort of just spin up a clone on any chain or any L2 that they want and let the market bootstrap itself. Whereas for Liquity, since the system is immutable and it also has a stablecoin attached to it, it's not so easy for us to do that. Because, I mean, one solution would be like, okay, yeah, we can deploy Liquity clones everywhere, but then there'd be like 5 LUSDs, which is not good for liquidity. It's not good for adoption. And I'm sure like centralized exchanges would just really hate us if they ever down the line wanted to integrate us. And they're like, why are there 5, LUSDs on all these different changes? Yeah. So we try to think of like ways that we could do some sort of bridge or some sort of create some sort of mechanism that allowed for borrowing on L2. And it just turned out to be way too technically complex, and it introduced a lot of surface area for things to go wrong. And so we kind of just halted efforts there just because it didn't seem like it was going to make sense for us. And even Maker, for example, have had this sort of similar issue since they're a similar protocol, but they recently worked on a solution that I guess works for them. But again, they have that freedom because they can change contracts, they can introduce new contracts, and they have governance. So that's one of those areas where like the immutability and the governance freeness is a bit of a hang up. But on the other hand, we also like a lot of our users don't care about the fees too much. Most of them are rather large ETH holders, and so the Ethereum gas fees aren't too problematic for them. But we are working on some sort of solution with a partner that could help for a few of our smaller users where gas fees are problematic. But I'll probably have more information on that in the near future. So I guess people will have to follow on Liquity Live or our Twitter account to keep up with that side of things.
Yeah. So are you like, does that worry you? Do you think, oh, well, what if all the activities on L2s, and people want, like, I suppose you'll continually be thinking about sort of a solution for like an implementation on like a different chain or whatever, but like, does that worry you? Do you think, oh, that could really actually affect our long-term viability?
It doesn't worry me too much because I think we're a long way off from all activity being on L2s. But also, I think like I trust our team to sort of figure that stuff out. If we really needed to make a pivot like that, I think we could, and we would figure out a good solution. But for now, it's really hard also to pick, what L2 or what L chain what other chain is appropriate. And the reason for that is because competition is just getting started, right? Like, how do we know who's going to be the winner out of, I don't know, Optimism and Arbitrum or Solana and Avalanche? And so for us, we don't feel like we're in a position where we could just like pick one and be certain that a year from now, that's where a lot of economic activity is going to be. So it makes sense for us to wait a bit, see how the landscape develops. And if we really need to evolve and adapt and end up on an L2 or another chain, I think we would do that. But for now, it's so early. It's just better for us to wait on the sidelines and see where the landscape goes.
Yeah, I suppose for a lot of protocols, it's kind of, they have buy-in, right? So if you're some big protocol and you go on Optimism or Arbitrum, and then you can kind of do a deal where you say, oh, well, when you release a token, you can like give us some or whatever, as being like a leader in the protocol. But you guys aren't really interested in having anything in your treasury, right? Like, there's no point because you can't decide how to distribute it.
Right. It's pretty difficult for us to do that just because, again, like this is where being a DAO would give, a project a lot more flexibility. But for us, it's just hard to manage like doing things like treasury swaps or making promises on like giving X token for, doing X or YZ. So yeah, it's a hard problem to think about. And on top of that, we're a top 10 DeFi protocol, but we're not like an Aave that has however, like what, $15 billion in it or something like this. So if they pick an L2, they have a lot of clout that kind of comes with that. And so they can bootstrap a market no problem and maybe bring a couple $1 billion over there or whatever the case may be. Whereas for us, we still feel like we're in a stage where we're growing a lot, and LUSD still has a ways to go in terms of network effects. And all of a sudden, if we start fragmenting those efforts, we just make our job a lot harder.
Very cool. So maybe we can just touch on DAOs. You've had a chance, I suppose, to like work for the firm, but you're also doing this growth work. You're exposed to a lot of DAOs and kind of how they work. Have you been kind of surprised about DAOs? Were you like, these won't ever work? People can't coordinate properly outside a company structure. I suppose you're very young, so it's well,
Yeah, I
very
do have
young,
a
but
little bit
like,
of
you
bias for
know,
being,
yeah.
I do have a youth bias, I guess. And also, like, crypto is kind of the only industry that I've ever really worked in. So I have that bias as well. I have, like, mixed opinions about DAOs and, like, what they should manage and what their responsibilities should be and stuff like that. I think, like, if we look in the context of Maker, I just think that's such a complex DAO to really be a part of and make super valuable contributions to, because there's so much that needs to be accounted for, right? They have to do all kinds of risk analysis to get different collateral types added. They have to make sure interest rates are managed properly. They have to make sure collateral ratios are managed properly. They have to manage this PSM module that they have. So there's all this stuff that has to be managed, where there's just not that many people who have the necessary skill sets to sort of partake in those type of discussions and make those type of decisions. And so your ability to scale up is severely limited. But there's also DAOs that sort of are a little bit less involved on that type of thing. Like, I consider Olympus DAO part of this, because so much of it is really community oriented, treasury oriented, content oriented, etc. So like, I think DAOs need to exist somewhere in between. I like the idea of DAOs mostly just being responsible for marketing efforts and content and community growth and all of those things. I'm not as big a fan of people managing like really important infrastructural, like economic levers of any kind. I think that's really, really hard. So that's where teams are really useful. And I mean, I think Olympus is learning this as well, like wanting to give the policy team a little bit more unilateral control over some of the decisions that are made, and having the policy team post a framework, etc. That type of stuff, I think, is really important to be managed by a tight-knit group of people rather than 70 people in a DAO.
Yeah.
But as far as working with DAOs, it's been very interesting because some DAOs are just more productive than others and more efficient than others and have better processes than others. And so at a company, you have a pretty set BD pipeline, you have a pretty set marketing pipeline, you have a pretty set content pipeline, whereas DAOs are a little bit more ad hoc, and they're just like, sometimes they just throw processes together. This is why I like working so closely with you guys at Olympus, is because like Olympus is really amazing to work with, but that's not true for every DAO. So that's my only real two gripes with DAOs. One, I think some of them have too much responsibility and it makes scaling the DAO difficult. And then two, some of them haven't done a great job of making sure that their processes are in place so that they can really, really succeed. So those are two things that could easily be figured out in the near future. I mean, DAOs are just really starting to get their footing over the last year and a half. So companies have been around for forever. So there's a little bit of a head start advantage there.
Yeah. I think with DAOs, it's like you have to be so consultative as well with all the contributors. It's very difficult to execute. So you might have like 10 people in a meeting where a company would have like 3 people in a meeting, like because everyone wants to know what's going on.
Exactly.
Yeah, crazy.
DAOs make it hard just because, I mean, there's this interesting challenge that DAOs have where they want as many people to get involved as possible, but on the other hand, you don't really want that for efficient processes, right? Like you were mentioning, like a DAO having 10 people in a meeting is really crazy because who takes point on that conversation afterward, or who's the one taking notes, or like who's the one who does the follow-up conversation. And it's like, is it just a a random pick of whoever does that, whoever happens to show up that day? So those are really interesting challenges that I think DAOs have ahead of them. Like, how do you scale and how do you scale properly such that everybody's in a position to where they can succeed long term without their work getting diluted, right? Like you don't want to be the person who owns, I don't know, let's say you're the person who owns marketing, but then 3 more marketing people join in a month, and then your workload gets diluted and you're kind of stuck in a position where you're like, okay, well, who owns what? How much leadership should this person really have, even though they're really skilled? All that good stuff. So I'm looking forward to frameworks developing that maybe solve that issue.
Yeah, hopefully our governance V2 is coming up. So not the token V2. There's actually this project in the DAO to have a new structure with like different accountabilities. So I think it's looking pretty cool. I think people will like it. But maybe
Yeah,
we can
that's
talk.
amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know one project that's really good at this type of stuff is Yearn. Yearn has really gone through it all in terms of governance, having to mint new YFI from Andre, like taking a big step back to Bantech taking over. So I have nothing but kind words for the way that Yearn has sort of evolved its governance and ecosystem. It hasn't really been easy for them, but they've always been the ones sort of leading the charge on trying to get that stuff right. So it's been fascinating to watch them grow, and I'm sure the Olympus framework is going to be just as good. I mean, you guys have a lot of smart minds working on stuff in the DAO. So
Yeah, it's just it's so big though. That's the problem.
it is massive.
Anyway, yeah. All right. Well, maybe you can quickly tell us like what's exciting coming up for Liquity, and then we can finish out.
Yeah, I think the biggest stuff is just we're just continuing to expand our ecosystem. I think, not too long ago, we recently hired a community manager who has been absolutely knocking it out of the park with content. And so we'll continue to expand our content, continue creating these sort of pipelines for people to find success in our ecosystem. We're also really doubling down on making sure that DAOs can get exposure to LUSD. We want to make sure that decentralized organizations have ultimate access to a decentralized stablecoin, and it only makes sense that a lot of these DAOs start to diversify. And LUSD seems like a prime candidate for that. I mean, it really doesn't make sense for even a DAO like Olympus DAO to have a whole bunch of USDC on the balance sheet. That's sort of an existential risk. So we're hoping LUSD can come in and really take the spotlight there. We've also seen more unique integrations recently where Synthetics SUSD peg on Optimism has been a little bit broken, and so they need an ARB mechanism, and so they're introducing support for minting SUSD against LUSD on Optimism in order to drive that peg down. So we love use cases like that.
Your LUSD is on Optimism then, or?
So there will be a bridge that basically allows people to port LUSD over. It's not a full integration, just a simple bridge integration. So pretty soon we might see a decent amount of LUSD on Optimism that maybe people can play with, at least from a trading perspective and from a perspective of arbing down SUSD. But those are all of the sort of things that we're pursuing, just continuing to drive LUSD's narrative as one of the best sort of decentralized stablecoins in the space, alongside our friends at Frax and Fei protocol.
Yeah. The peg was so broken. It was like 30% off.
Yeah, it was pretty tough. I mean, they were in an emergency situation where I think originally they were using ETH to allow for the minting of SUSD to bring the peg down, and they just couldn't get enough ETH there, I don't think.
Yeah.
And then they wanted LUSD, but there was no LUSD bridge at the time, and so we were all on like this emergency governance call, and I think they agreed to allow DAI to happen just until the LUSD bridge was set up. So hopefully we can roll that out really, really soon and help them out, because I mean, we want to make sure that all of our decentralized friends are adequately pegged, and I think the best way to do that is to all work together on a lot of this stuff, like Fei, Frax, LUSD, and even SUSD, like making sure that all of us are even ALUSD from Alchemix as well, like making sure all of us are collaborative and setting each other up for success ensures that we can sort of, I guess, topple the USDC and USDT overlords in DeFi, because we can only do it together. Decentralized stablecoins have practical scaling solution or scaling ceilings that they always hit, and so the only way we can do it is an aggregate. And eventually, I think if we all work together, we'll succeed in doing so, or at least I hope.
Yeah, that's very nice of you to say. I think, you see it more and more now, this kind of culture, very collaborative culture between projects and DAOs. I'm super big fan of LUSD. I always just feel so comfy when it's the stable coin in my wallet. I don't I used to have that feeling towards USDC, but then like the more you learn about it, the more you're kind of like, well, it's actually not that great.
Exactly. They introduce all kind of risks that usually people, I mean, the average person, if they're just getting into DeFi, like USDC exposure is not going to be a big deal. But as you sort of learn the philosophy of DeFi and what we're trying to do here, you eventually start to find a little bit of distaste toward both USDC and USDT, or anybody who relies too much on them. And so it's been cool for people to latch on to the sort of decentralized narrative and start to feel more cozy holding stablecoins that are backed by more supreme types of collateral, like ETH, for example.
Yeah, because yours is backed by $1 worth of ETH. So actually, it's actually just ETH that's been now redenominated in a $1 US worth, right? It's not.
Yeah, exactly. So
it's not a stable
it's backed
coin,
by something
really.
you trust.
It's like, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a little bit of a mental barrier, because I was like, people were like, well, Olympus is backed. And then I was like, yeah, it's backed. It's got like ETH and stable coins. And they're like, yeah, but the stable coins are just US dollars. And I'm like, no, they're not. They're like $1 worth of backing, you know? They're not, it's got nothing to do with the dollar really in terms of how it's backed. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the dollar is more of just an accounting trick at this point, because I mean, dollars are something that everybody around the world understands. And so if they see a dollar, they sort of understand the value that they have. But I think what's really important is what's backing that dollar, and can it ever be confiscated from you? And in the case of USDC and USDT, those can be frozen and your balance can be taken from you. And so it's important that, you know, you hold something like LUSD or Frax or, you know, whatever else, so that, you know, you can feel cozy holding your LUSD or whatever decentralized stablecoin you choose, as you mentioned, and know that, you know, nothing can be stripped out from under you.
Yeah, and they might decide not to redeem it, you know, like if something comes along and they're like, no, you can't, you know, these people are excluded from redeeming. And then what you get back is a piece of paper that's got a $1 on it, you know. It's
Exactly.
Like, it's not backed by anything.
Yeah, exactly.
Very cool. Well, it's been super nice to talk to you, Kolten. Thanks for taking the time to come and talk to us today and teach us a bit about Liquity and give your background and your story. It's been lovely.
Yeah, of course. Anytime. Thanks for having me on, Mark.
All right. Ohmies, we will be releasing this on the 15th of November, and we will be having a Spaces on Tuesday the 16th Asia time, 8 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, 5 p.m. Singapore time, and then we will, later this week, we'll have the regular Spaces on Thursday the 18th at 3 p.m. Pacific, and then we'll be back with another News of the Week on the 19th. But till next time, Ohmies, we'll see you. Goodbye.